And we're going. This is the North County San Diego Democracy at Work Action Group reading of Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. And we're going to pick up where we left off, I believe. And where did we leave off, guys?
We left off at section 2.3, which is, I'm assuming that I haven't seen this in some time, but chapter 2, section 3, the bailouts, monetary agencies, and monetary policies. So, do you want to start us off, James, or do you want me, or Rocky? Would you? Up order.
I can do the honors.
Cool.
Classical monetary policy entails lowering interest rates and increasing the money supply to counteract an economic downturn. This task traditionally falls to a nation's central bank. In the United States, for the past century, that has meant the Federal Reserve System. Indeed, since 2007, the Federal Reserve has driven interest rates down and kept them down to an unprecedented degree. It has likewise dramatically increased the money supply, commonly described in the financial press as quantitative easing. Because of the political conditions I discussed above, when the 2007 crisis hit, politicians remained hesitant about expanding deficits and the debt. The limits they observed meant the fiscal policy could not end or overcome the crisis. As leading Keynesian economists kept lamenting, expansionary deficits were too little and too late. Therefore, a disproportionate share of the burden of overcoming the crisis fell to monetary policy and to the Fed. Its chairman, Ben Bernanke, bemoaned that burden repeatedly. In March 2008, the Fed provided funds to J.P. Morgan Chase to buy out the investment bank Bear Stearns at a subsidized price. In September 2008, the Fed provided an $85 billion loan to AIG in return for an 80% stake in the company. This was crucial to reassure owners of CDS, insurance policies on ABS holdings, and all other participants in credit markets that the debts underlying ABS would be paid. Do you recall what CDS and ABS stand for, Frank?
I was just credit default swap is CDS.
And then I think ABS is asset-backed securities. Does that sound right?
Okay. That sounds good.
Okay, so I'll continue. Increasingly, the Federal Reserve moved on multiple fronts to unfreeze the credit markets. It purchased illiquid, distressed, and toxic securities of all kinds and maturities from banks and other financial enterprises, sometimes on its own and sometimes in buying partnerships with private enterprises. The Fed also provided massive loans to the same sorts of enterprises under the Term Asset-Backed Securities Loan Facility. The Fed poured huge sums into buying debt and mortgage-backed securities from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae, the major government supports for the U.S. housing industry, which were eventually taken over by the U.S. government. These and many other programs, both traditional Fed operations and new innovations to unfreeze credit quickly, moved trillions of dollars of bad assets off of private financial enterprises' balance sheets and onto those of the Fed and the U.S. Treasury. Monetary agencies also insured private debts as well as deposits of various sorts. For example, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, administered the Temporary Liquidity Guarantee Program, TLGP, which provided guarantees for both non-interest-bearing transaction accounts at FDIC-covered banks and also for those banks' senior debt. The amounts involved reached into the hundreds of billions. I can stop there if you want.
Yeah, I can take over if you want.
Yeah. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Are you guys familiar with Ginnie Mae?
No.
No, I don't know what that is.
Neither do I. I was just wondering. I've heard of the other two, obviously. Are you guys familiar with the other two? I just know they have to do with some loans that have school loans are wrapped up in there. But I'm not familiar with how those work.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar. They back mortgage loans, right? I think
so.
I'm not up to date on it.
Are they both still in existence? I kind of thought one either went under or was subsumed or acquired by
I don't know.
Another entity. I'd have to check on that, though. I'm not sure.
All right.
My general thought on this, what we've read so far, right, is that we don't have enough money to pay teachers. We don't have enough money to pay insurance for poor people. But we always have enough money to pay banks. I mean, when we need the money, it just magically appears. But when we need it for other things, oh, sorry, we don't have any money.
Yes, I think that has to do with, and I'll just play devil's advocate for a second, but I think the reason is because of the more dire circumstances we would have been in if we didn't.
Right. And, I think Wolff is lending some credence to what you're suggesting there, Frank, to that argument, but I think that's part of his larger indictment of the system that brings us to such dire straits, right? It's like the system that actually requires us to do this in order to keep it functioning. And so I was going to ask you, are you all familiar with the Federal Reserve policy at all, and the ideas about quantitative easing?
Yeah, I've been following that a lot.
I have a very superficial understanding of it. When I think of it, I see a guy with a bunch of knobs and levers trying to control the money flow and, pumping some in if it looks like we need it, pumping some out. And these knobs and levers are figuratively the APR of the country or whatever, the interest rates and things like this.
My understanding is, along James' comments, that they've mostly done two things. One is keep the interest rates low, and the other is the quantitative easing. So they've just been pumping money into the economy. And it's not just the Federal Reserve. The Bank of Japan, the European Bank has been doing the same thing. And sometimes one of them will slow down, the Federal Reserve will back down on how much it's pumping in, but the other ones step up and go ahead. And now recently the Federal Reserve has started to say, okay, we're gonna back off on that. First, they've started to raise interest rates,
right?
And what I've heard is that what they're worried about is that when we do get into a recession, they need some room to cut interest rates to kind of give this boost to the economy. But if interest rates are at zero, they can't cut it. So they're trying to slowly creep it up without causing the recession that they're afraid is coming. And they've also been saying, right, that they're going to reduce the quantitative easing, and in fact start pulling money out. And they do that by when they do the quantitative easing, they buy bonds, right? And what they'll do is when those bonds mature, whoever gave them the bond, the government or whoever, pays the Federal Reserve that money. And what they'll do is they'll just say, okay, and it'll just disappear. So that money that came out of nowhere will all of a sudden just, when the bond's paid off, it'll just disappear. So they're talking about raising interest rates, doing exactly the opposite of what they've been doing, raising interest rates and actually pulling money out of the economy instead of putting it into it. Now, they have been raising interest rates slowly, but in reality, the quantitative easing is still going. And if it's not the Federal Reserve that is slowing down, but there's still quantitative easing in
parts of the world.
I can't remember. It was the ECB or Bank of Japan was still going pretty hard. And then the last comment on that is that there's some people say that the tax bill that went through, where they cut the tax 40%, right? That in fact is just like quantitative easing, right? You're just giving all these corporations who would have to pay this money, now they don't have to pay. So it's kind of a sneaky way to keep quantitative easing going while you're saying, oh, no, we're cutting back. But to really keep it going is the tax bill.
Interesting.
That's my knowledge of it.
There's one other thought that I had. So after that part about where Wolff mentions quantitative easing, he points out that because politicians were wary of expanding deficits, which always seems like such a selective thing. It's like, we don't care if you do it for this reason, but for progressive reasons, then we usually care. But in this case, they didn't want to, or they had maybe ideological reasons not to, and because of that, then the burden fell on the Fed to do something. It fell on Fed policy, and so that's interesting. Like, why that different take? Like why instead of like directly through government monies, raising the debt and deficits, take care of the problem versus take care of it through the like quasi-governmental institution of the Fed.
Yeah, and then, like the question is, well, you could have just all the people who don't have jobs, right? You could have made jobs for them. You could have cleaned up parks or whatever, and the government could have just the money that was printed and given to the banks could have been printed and given to people to do jobs to clean up the parks or whatever. But my 2 cents on that is the reason they didn't do that is that the people who Congress in their back pocket are the banks and not the people who don't have jobs.
That would be my guess too. Yeah.
We are not in the back pockets of our politicians. As much as we want to get in that ass, we're not there.
Well put, Frank.
Thanks. Thank you.
Can we cut some of this or just go straight out? Right?
Go straight out. We are totally
I'm
raw and
sure
uncut.
One listener will be fine.
We're raw and uncut here in North County, DFW.
All right, so I don't really have anything to add except that you had said when they can't go any lower than 0%, didn't they start doing negative interest rates? Isn't that a thing? Yeah.
There is a talk about negative interest rates, and part of that is, yeah, you can go negative. You can go negative interest rates, but if people have cash, right, then people, because if your bank account is going negative, you just pull the money out in cash, right? Because then it's not going to go negative on you. You stick it in the safe deposit box or underneath your mattress.
I had heard that Japan ended up doing that for some time.
I don't know if they did or not.
Oh, okay.
But I have heard some talk about that those in power would like to have that option, and so they're trying to limit cash like they did in India, right? Where they just, one day, the president just stood up, or whatever, he's the prime minister, whatever he is, just stood up and said, these large domination bills are now illegal. And some people are speculating that it's like a test, right? To see how can we pull it out so that people don't use cash, so that if we go negative interest rates, people won't just pull their money out of the bank.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting. All right, I'll continue unless you got something else, James?
No, go ahead.
All right, same section. In short, the United States mobilized many of its financial and monetary agencies to massively socialize its monetary system. Private financial enterprises had ceased to be able to function normally in terms of depositing, borrowing, and lending. Their relationships with one another and with the public, the credit system, had frozen. Consequently, by late 2008, most of the major private financial enterprises were technically as defunct or bankrupt as Lehman Brothers had been when it collapsed. That freeze threatened to spread quickly via the interdependence among all markets in today's global economy. The U.S. government mobilized its agencies and resources to buy, lend, insure, guarantee, and invest trillions for as many years into the future as necessary to secure two interrelated goals. The first goal was to prevent the freeze from spreading into the non-financial aspect of the economy. The second goal was to dissolve the freeze so that credit flows could resume sufficiently to enable the economy to work its way through the crisis, bottom out, and eventually return to economic growth. The Obama administration provided the vast funds and guarantees necessary to achieve these goals. At the same time, it endlessly repeated the notion that it was, quote, assisting rather than, quote, replacing the private banking sector of U.S. capitalism. Together with the banks themselves, the government spread the ideological message that the socialization or nationalization of banking had not happened, that banks unable to function without massive government supports were nonetheless still private enterprises. The government's supports were always referred to as temporary, although no one could know how long each of them might be continued or whether and when they might need to be resumed. Even when the U.S. government purchased shares in major U.S. banks and other corporations, they were mostly non-voting shares. The point again was to maintain and underscore the largely fictional private nature of these companies that were so utterly dependent on government support to survive. Among the most remarkable aspects of the rapid and intense socialization of banking and credit in the United States starting in 2008 were its leaders and its taboos. The leaders were most of the CEOs of the nation's largest financial enterprises. After years of speeches celebrating private enterprise as the engine of growth and prosperity and denouncing government as the source of economic inefficiency and waste, those CEOs led the rush to Washington for trillions in assistance. They took what was offered and more. The socialization of U.S. financial enterprises and markets was not the work of social critics, radicals, or Marxists. The finance CEOs managed it to serve their interests. Perhaps now it will be better understood that capitalists rarely oppose government intervention per se, even though they like to say so to stave off unwanted kinds of government intervention. What they want, and what they embrace en masse, is other kinds of government intervention. They want the government to facilitate their profitable activities, clean up the periodic economic messes they make, keep them firmly in charge of finance and credit, and make the general public, rather than the financial industry, pay the huge costs of all that. The remarkable taboo successfully observed in the U.S. mainstream was that this socialization was not happening, that private financial enterprises remained private and functioning, even when one and often both of these adjectives did not apply. This taboo extended to include public discussions of what should be done in response to the financial dimensions of the crisis in Congress, the media, and academia, with very few exceptions. Virtually no one reasoned publicly that a private banking and credit system that performed so poorly and with such disastrous economic and social consequences had forfeited the right to continue. After all, banks and many other financial enterprises are considered intermediaries. They take deposits, loans, and investments from others and then parcel out those funds to various borrowers for various uses. They are supposed to perform this vital economic function, on which a credit-based economy like ours depends, with expert care, prudence, caution, and ongoing foresight. After all, they are distributing other people's money and funding the activities shaping the economy's trajectory into the future, and hence all of our lives. These private financial enterprises occupy a very consequential place in our society. They have social duties to perform. They can and should be judged accordingly. I'm just going to see what's... Okay, let's get them out there. I don't know if one of you guys want to take over or not.
Yeah, I'll take over.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about what was read there?
I feel like he's starting to shift from what we were talking about a lot with the credit default swaps, and there's a lot of jargon there that I'm not familiar with, obviously, and so a lot of it's kind of dry for me, at least for some of the listeners. But I feel like he's transitioning more into normative kind of area, so it's going to be a little bit easier for at least me to partake in.
Yeah, and tying it together, he's pointing out, right, that there's socialization of, like you've heard probably before, socialization of costs and privatization of profits in a lot of ways. But then also, that taboo he's talking about is like the fact that the government did, in effect, socialize these major financial enterprises. Like, people didn't talk about it like that. Although, I think maybe he's not giving credit where credit is due, because I think there was a lot of public backlash against it, although not necessarily in the mainstream.
I don't know. I certainly remember, and I think I'm referring to the right thing here, but I heard a lot of backlash against, and this is all TARP, right? A lot of this was considered TARP money. And so I do remember a couple news articles, of a lot of people kind of bemoaning the fact that the money was going there. But I don't think it was ever, the verbiage wasn't used. It wasn't like, this is bad because we're socializing these industries or whatever, these companies. It was more of, you're taking our money and giving them to failure. Like, we're giving this money to failure of these banks.
Right.
So, yeah.
The other additional argument that he lays out here, or that's connected, is that he's suggesting that the credit system, the banks and financial enterprises, they provide we depend upon them, and they, provide important social duties. And that being the case, that I think he's, implying that another kind of socialization could and should be tried, which is to democratize them, to put them under public control, make them publicly accountable, which is the exact opposite of the kind of socialization that happened.
Should we continue?
I'll continue. All right. Perhaps most importantly, to safeguard the funds of their depositors, lenders, and investors, private financial enterprises are entrusted to choose those to whom they lend with care, exercising what the applicable laws call due diligence. Banks and other private financial enterprises are supposed to evaluate borrowers' creditworthiness at the time a loan is extended, but also throughout its duration. These private financial enterprises and the larger society they are supposed to serve need to be assured that the borrower can repay the loan and its interest cost. If private financial enterprises purchase insurance, CDS, on outstanding loans, they need to be sure that the private financial insurers can pay legitimate claims in the event of defaults by borrowers. In fact, since 2007, the crisis has repeatedly demonstrated that most of the larger private financial enterprises, and many smaller ones as well, perform their obligations disastrously. Their failures to serve society's need for safe and effective financial intermediation led to huge social losses and costs. Yet there was an effective taboo against drawing one obvious inference from those failures. Almost no one in politics, the establishment, media, or academia dare to say that such failures of a private finance system raise the question of how a public financial system might function better. There were proposals to allow markets to punish failing banks, to allow the government greater regulatory oversight, as formalized in the latter Dodd-Frank legislation, and for greater transparency. But such proposals could not and did not challenge the continuation of financial enterprises as private institutions. It was beyond the pale to suggest the nationalization of banks and other financial enterprises to guarantee the proper performance that private enterprises had failed so spectacularly to achieve, even as the nation subsidized their existence for years with trillions of dollars. I noted earlier that continued high unemployment and its devastating economic effects provoked discussions of countless stimulus programs, but always with respecting the basic taboo on a federal jobs program. The vast preponderance of political, media, and intellectual discussions swirled around the pros and cons of programs to stimulate or encourage or provide incentives for private employers to hire more people. The fact that from 2009 to 2012, such programs failed to diminish unemployment in any serious way, let alone end it, did not lead to proposals to fashion contemporary equivalents of Roosevelt's federal employment program. Capitalist economies, including that of the United States, have a long history of limiting, regulating, or socializing enterprises and industries whose profit-maximizing strategies risk undermining those of capitalist enterprises collectively. Thus, to take but a few examples, transportation and communication industries have been managed in this way across many societies. In the United States, every one of the 50 states has an insurance commission to monitor and regulate profits of enterprises that in that industry, after a long experience of its negative consequences for other capitalist industries and society as a whole, generated outcries and alliances strong enough to impose commissions on the insurance industry. Much the same applies to the enterprises in the public utility industries, such as electricity, gas, and water. Monopolies have been repeatedly broken up for similar reasons. In Europe, several countries have at various times nationalized their banks. That happened historically as a consequence of profound social dissatisfaction with how the profit-driven strategies of private banks contributed to economic crises, which tolerated social costs with intolerable social costs. In the United States, the Great Depression provoked congressional hearings that revealed extensive conflicts of interest and fraud committed by banks and their investment subsidiaries. The resulting Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act, gave the Federal Reserve the power to regulate savings accounts, interest rates, and also prohibit bank holding companies from owning other kinds of financial enterprises in order to stop banks from using their depositors' funds for risky investments. Such controls of what private capitalists can charge and do were steps toward, even as they stopped short of, a full nationalization of banking. The Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010 was the parallel, though much weaker, banking reform legislation for the post-2007.
Hello? Hey, you guys.
In which banking practices had contributed to this major capitalist crisis. Indeed, there were obvious similarities in how private capitalist financial enterprises had contributed to both crises. As many commentators noted, the latest capitalist crisis exploded a mere 8 years after Glass-Steagall was finally repealed in 1999. Major U.S. banks had led the way toward that repeal through years of lobbying and public relations campaigns. Immediately after achieving its repeal, those same banks proceeded to commingle depositors' funds and risky ABS and CDS investments in just the ways Glass-Steagall was meant to prevent. Not surprisingly, that speculative, thank you, commingling once again helped produce a mammoth downturn.
Sometimes I don't agree with the way he writes, but it's a lot of what he says is a mouthful sometimes. But I'm really glad that he pointed out the fact that it was only 8 years after they repealed Glass-Steagall that it occurred, and I had never thought of that. I had never looked at the chronology that way. That was that soon after they did that, and so
yeah, it was during the Clinton administration.
Yeah, I was just thinking it took a Democrat to do that and then a Republican to finish it off. But
like reading through this, one thing that keeps coming to my mind is that many people, they don't spend time getting into this. They don't know this stuff.
Absolutely.
They don't even care, right? I have a family member who Facebook, and he wrote me. I posted something and it made him mad, right, about the capitalist system, and he responded saying, the capitalist system is a good system, and I've made good money in it, and I'm happy with the money I've got.
So there. Take that, Rocky.
I almost feel, I was thinking about this when we were reading that it reminds me of the metaphor of water to a fish. I feel like capitalism to most people's minds is just the way it is, and the idea to go away from it is it kind of is a sort of knee-jerk reaction in a lot of people. And that reminds me of when Nancy Pelosi did her little thing when someone in the audience had asked about, maybe democratic socialism becoming more of a thing and what she thought of it, and she was very upfront and was like, "We are capitalists, and that's all there is to it."
Right. Yeah.
And so, that's the water. Like, that's what we breathe here, especially here. Europe's a whole other thing. And so, I think it's important to note that.
The comment is, we are capitalists, and if it ever goes any farther than that, it's And of course, we don't want communism because that's Stalin and killing millions of people. We don't want millions of people to get killed.
Yeah, non sequiturs in my opinion, but they're, man, some jumps. Lots of jumps there. Big jumps.
But I mean, what's always missing, right, is the way that capitalism isn't capitalism like people think about it, as Wolff is documenting here, right? There's plenty of socialism going on. It's just socialism for those at the top, and socialism that enables the highly iniquitous system and anti-democratic system to keep its engine turning.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too. That all the people that are just saying capitalism is great, they don't even see that, right? That we don't really have capitalism now. We have a socialism for the well-to-do.
You know, one thing that I think we should be wary of is, like, I would like to start trying to find out the refutations of this from those who are, you know, pretty hardcore economists and kind of know what they're talking about, as opposed to, you know, talking about, you know, someone I know who doesn't really know anything about, you know, economics. They're obviously going to kind of, you know, spew the kind of stuff they are always kind of indoctrinated in anyways. And so they're not, you know, it's kind of low-hanging fruit there. And so I want to like find out what the legitimate boilerplate refutations of this are, what they are and what they sound like and what they mean and whatnot from those perspectives. And I don't know exactly what they are right now, but I think that it would help for us to learn those.
But if memory serves, I know some of the justifications that were given for, say, the repealing of Glass-Steagall and some of the other financial policy changes that were made during the Clinton administration. It was, you know, all in the name of modernization, right? And we live in a global economy, and so we can't be constrained by these regulations. They're gonna, like, interfere with business, right? And that's a problem. And so, and perhaps maybe to some extent that's true in a globalized capitalist economy, which points to further contradictions, right, within the system.
Yeah, but I'm wondering what does that mean? What exactly does it mean to? I understand the general idea of we need to modernize for a globalized economy, and I get that. I mean, that sounds on the face of it completely legitimate. On the other hand, that's not really a refutation of you know, that's not really a reason. That's not a concrete reason for repealing Glass-Steagall. Like, I'm wondering what the specifics are, what the details are of, like, yes, we do need to modernize, absolutely, but, you know, at what cost? What's that going to cost us? And then, you know, 8 years later, we found out what that could cost us. But I'm wondering what the minutia was that they were talking about in '99, and as far as, like, cutting it, because on the airwaves, we're going to hear the normal spoutings of, you know, we're going to get rid of that red tape, and this is the biggest red tape we will be able to get rid of. Yeah. And, like, the big, you know, the red tape over all the other red tape. But, I mean, what were they saying in the back rooms as far as, like, convincing the congressman to go with it, I wonder, you know?
I mean, I doubt the Congress needed that much convincing. But, point taken, yeah, I'm sure there were folks who were trying to offer much stronger justifications, right? You know, and socially, scientifically grounded justifications, whether they were good in the end, good ones or not. I mean, it certainly seems not. But I mean, you know, Glass-Steagall separated commercial and investment banks, and so it allowed those two to merge. And there are reasons you could offer for wanting to do that, I think, right? I mean, aside from just the less specific cutting the red tape. Like, maybe it helped bolster some of the commercial banks. Maybe it allowed investment banks to offer loans to businesses, big and small, more easily. Things like that, I believe, would maybe be the reasons that were bandied about then.
But, I mean, the thing that gets me is that argument could have been made in all the decades since Glass-Steagall. All the decades. So why in '99?
Well, again, it's, in the age of globalization where there was further competition abroad and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I wish I could have been there in whatever room it was where someone would say that, and then you would hear what the opposing side would say. Well, do that, and you're going to see another 1929 happen, and to see what was said against that. Like, what are the Milton Friedman saying about this? You know what I mean?
Yeah, or people like Alan Greenspan, who is
Greenspan. That was the other guy I was trying to think of.
Big champion of this sort of thing. Yep.
Yeah. And so, I don't know.
You might forgive my cynicism, but I think you give them too much credit. I mean, I don't know.
I really don't too much credit.
Congressmen. And
oh yeah.
They're not going in there. Well, give me a good reason for this. It's I'm paying your ass.
Yeah, you're right. No. I share your cynicism there. I'm just wondering. There was an erosion that had to have happened over time.
Sure.
What was the thing that was the last rock that eroded? What were those, or what were the big ones? Like, because obviously since the 80s, I think it was, or the late 70s, there's been a slow dismantling of this kind of thing. And so Glass-Steagall didn't happen overnight. But I'm wondering what were the major arguments used for it? And what is an intellectual like Greenspan, how do they legitimize it?
Part of it, I think, has to be situated in that political moment and within what the Clinton administration was doing, right? Because, what was Clinton's famous slogan, at least early on, like, it's the economy, stupid. And he was, this modernizing Democrat that realized things had to change, right? You had to transform welfare as people knew it, which meant, in effect, kicking millions of children into further poverty because their mother couldn't, get the subsidized food and necessities, and that was done under Clinton, and that was sort of his, that was his claim to fame. That was why he was as popular as he was, but and so I think this has to be read kind of as part of that strategy, that neoliberal strategy, shifting society further to the right, at least economically speaking. And so I think at least that was the ideological cover, right? That it's like, this is the wave of the future. We can't keep doing things the way we're doing, and we'll be progressive. Like, it's flipping the idea of progressive kind of on its head.
Yeah. And I do think they can just get away with more and more, right? They're just being more and more blatant about it, and then just people aren't doing anything. So, okay, let's go a little farther. Let's do more.
You're right.
Nobody's complaining. Let's keep going.
Appeasement. Yeah. Interesting.
Do you want me to pick up where we left off?
Sure. I don't remember where. Oh, I think. Yeah. Do you know where we're at?
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
And so let's keep these questions in the back of our mind and maybe return to them after I finish this second. All right. Glass-Steagall had always been an unwanted burden on major U.S. banks. After it passed despite their opposition, banks responded with various strategies to evade its provision and then to weaken and eventually repeal it. They succeeded in 1999 under President Clinton, a Democrat. Even when 2007 ushered in another major crisis and overwhelming evidence of the complicity of banks in producing it, the major banks were successful in preventing the reenactment of Glass-Steagall provisions in new laws. Large banks and major corporations had generally changed political conditions in their favor. They had learned how to devote more resources in better ways to influence legislative outcomes. At the height of the post-2007 crisis, major banks demanded and received massive government help on the basis of a threat. They were, they insisted, too big to fail. The idea seemed to be that letting them collapse or default would have such devastating consequences for the larger economy that the government had to help them in the national interest. The fallout from the collapse of the Lehman Brothers investment bank was used as the perfect example of why such a colossal mistake could not be replicated. They used such arguments in public and congressional debates, eventually garnering trillions of dollars in government support. However, the bank's arguments had two logical implications that had to be blocked from public discussion, let alone action. More taboos were thereby revealed. The first implication was that such large enterprises should be broken up into smaller enterprises so that the failure of any one would not effectively blackmail the government into costly support. So effectively were the few public statements in that direction ignored and repressed that nothing much was said, and certainly nothing was done, about the fact that many of the major U.S. banks were significantly larger in 2012 than they had been in 2007. If there was a moral hazard that bailing out big banks during and after 2008 might weaken their resolve to avoid excess risk thereafter, then allowing big banks to become bigger accelerated the moral hazard involved. The second implication that had to be repressed was this. If big banks and other financial enterprises were too big to fail, then perhaps the solution was to nationalize them. Making their assets and liabilities fully transparent and publicly available would minimize the chance of behaviors that place society at risk. Officials of government banking agencies would be subject to political scrutiny and to elections, thereby making them more accountable. The dependence of enterprises and the public on electricity, water, postal service, the broadcast spectrum, and other such services has led governments in many countries to either regulate or nationalize the private enterprises producing those services. When regulation proves inadequate or insufficient, nationalization is often a logical next step. However, neoliberal ideology effectively enforced a taboo against recognizing this implication of the too-big-to-fail arguments. In the end, the last century of capitalism teaches a profound truth by means of repeated, specific lessons regarding government economic interventions that regulate, limit, or constrain capitalist goals. Such economic interventions are resisted by major capitalist enterprises. If they pass into law, corporations use their expanding resources, rising net incomes, to evade, weaken, and eliminate those restrictions, as we saw with the successful campaign to repeal Glass-Steagall. There are many other examples in the United States and in other countries. In European countries where banks, public utilities, and transportation enterprises were nationalized, capitalists responded likewise and have often succeeded in re-privatizing them. Simply put, so long as a major economic sector consists of large private capitalist enterprises accumulating rising net incomes, they can and will devote energy and resources to removing government interventions they do not want. Government economic interventions that constrain large capitalist enterprises in the pursuit of the rising profits, market shares, and growth rates they seek are therefore always fundamentally insecure. This applies to government regulation as well as partial or selective nationalizations of private capitalist enterprises. A good metaphor for the historical lesson here is this. In a war that ends with the victor imposing heavy, enduring burdens on the loser, the victor must also disarm the loser. Otherwise, the loser will be tempted to use the arms it has retained to relieve those burdens. In the political wars that imposed regulations and partial selective nationalizations on major capitalist enterprises, those corporate enterprises retained capitalist structures. Their small collectives of major shareholders and boards of directors provided them with the incentives and resources to overturn the regulations and nationalizations. In most modern capitalist economies, the Great Depression of the 1930s produced government regulations and nationalizations because of pressure from working-class organizations, labor unions, and left political parties. In each case, after 1945, the large capitalist enterprises in those countries used their resources to evade, weaken, and eliminate the restrictions. The timing and extent of their successes has varied with the specific historical conditions and balance of class forces in each country. As I will show in detail in the second part of this book, the historical lessons about the reversibility of nationalization and regulation of capitalist enterprises applies also to the state socialist societies in the USSR, elsewhere in Eastern Europe, and beyond. In short, it applies to general and widespread, as well as partial and selective nationalizations. Where state officials have replaced boards of directors elected by major shareholders, and thus where workers continue to produce surpluses and profits for others, such state officials will also face incentives and deploy resources to deregulate and denationalize their enterprises as conditions permit. That concludes section 2.3. What do you... Yeah, go ahead.
It was frustrating for me to listen to that and go through that because you say all this stuff and it's just, there's Glass-Steagall is enacted and it just slowly gets overturned. But then it was summarized in the end there, which that Wolff has stated before, right? That you can't, enacting new laws doesn't work because they always come back and overturn them. So
that just means that we have to get the right folks in and get them to stay in.
See, but I don't think it. I agree. If you could get the right folks in, if you get good people in, but it never lasts. So it goes back to, I mean.
Right, and it never lasts because of what he pointed out. It's like with that war metaphor, right? So long as you have the major economic sector consisting of large private capitalist enterprises that are controlled by small groups of people, right? They're going to use their resources to influence the political system, and to do that in such a way that, again, like they try to disarm the loser. So not only are you screwed economically speaking, just in terms of the fundamental institutional arrangements within capitalism, but you're not going to be able to use the political system either, because we're going to wield all of our money and resources to try to defeat you politically. Like, that's the point that he's making, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's depressing. This does remind me, though, of what we did to Germany after World War I, Versailles Treaty. We imposed very harsh restrictions on Germany, including monetary ones, to the tune of $33 billion. But, Hitler made it after that. He came back, and he actually, he...
Are you citing Hitler as inspiration? for political economic woes? God.
But I mean, what I am saying though is that that's actually, I just wanted to make that joke.
Okay.
Because we are the Hitler in that situation. I just hope that we don't resort to those types of things. But it is cool how what we're saying has kind of led me. Oh well, then what could one do if this keeps occurring? And one nice way of counteracting it is to push democratic workplaces so that the surplus can start shifting and transitioning over time into the hands of those who have a more prudent outlook on the entire system itself.
In the book, go ahead, Rocky.
I love that about Wolff too, and it might be we might be jumping ahead in the book because he probably talks about it later. But that's a solution that the corporations now use their resources, but to get more equitable access to those resources, which a co-op would do. I mean, that's a slow, gradual way to make that change.
Certainly.
We may not be able to do the slow way. It may turn out to be, turn into fascism and a Hitler for a quick revolution. But
there's a political economist, Garl Pervitz. I think I mentioned him to you guys before. I think he's had some like public discussion or something with Wolff before. But one of the things that he talks about in the book that he wrote a couple of years back, The Next American Revolution, or maybe I think it was like What Then Must We Do? And it's about the next American Revolution, which he considers more an evolution. And he's a big proponent of worker co-ops and networked worker co-ops and that sort of thing. And he has this notion, he's not the one that invented it, but this idea of the checkerboard strategy, where, I mean, just the basic metaphor is, you move places where you can move, right, that are open to you, and then when those close, then you just move somewhere else and try to make those slow gains by staying, like one step ahead and taking advantage of the resources that you do have available to you when they're there.
While continuing to move.
Yeah, while continuing to move, yeah, exactly.
Or moving to the places that you can work it and then growing them, right? But my concern is that they're juggling the economy right now, and they've got a bunch of balls in the air, and I don't think they're going to be able to keep it going long enough. I think we should work for educating people, starting checkerboards, because maybe it'll pan out, and even if it collapses, at least you've got something to start from, I can say. But I think it's going to collapse before we get too far.
Really?
No, but I mean, I think what.
For this bunch of cynic.
It's coming out.
Yeah.
Coming out, yeah.
But I mean, it's interesting to think about what collapse would look like, and if collapse would be permanent, right? I mean, there's been near collapses in a lot of places, in Argentina, 2000, 2001, or Venezuela, or Greece and Spain. But I mean, it's not like the societies totally just crumble or anything. And so what you said there about trying to start building things now and, you know, advancing that checkerboard strategy, how that puts in place, you know, institutions, or at least prefigures institutions and organizations that then could maybe pick up during a collapse and do something.
You know, because I think that having access to the surplus is a key component, and the more people who have that idea in their mind, even if they're not living in at their workplace right now, if it does collapse and you're then looking, okay, well, what do we do now? The more people say, well, let's go in that direction of more equitable access to the surplus, and I think that'd be better.
Do you think we're going to collapse before that happens?
Well, I think before we slowly develop it, and who knows, maybe we can. Maybe we can slowly develop cooperatives, and it'll overtake capitalism, and it'll be nice and pretty. But I'm worried because just things are so crazy right now, right? That I don't know. I'm worried that it can't continue on. That the Federal Reserve is trying to juggle all these balls, keep the things going.
Yeah. I can't imagine what an American collapse would look like.
And you know, it's not totally unrelated to the decrease in interstate power that the United States has too, right? If we're thinking about it globally, and that's almost incontrovertible, and it's kind of, I mean, I think often about where that's headed too, as the decline of U.S. hegemony and that sort of thing, and the place of the United States internationally in the global world system.
I just read today that China put through their first contract. I may not say the words just right, but their first contract using the yuan. Petrol. Instead of the petrodollar, it's the petrol. They put the contract in being paid in, what's their currency? The yuan?
The yen?
The yen, yeah.
Oh, so, okay.
Now, anybody else who's even talked about that, we've killed them.
Really?
Right? So, that China is a little tougher, right? It's not so easy for us to go and kill.
No. Can't squash that bug. Wow, that's pretty intense.
I think it was maybe Wolff who talked on a recent economic update about how China has, increasingly formed its own counter institutions to the ones that are dominated by the United States, like its own parallel sort of institutions and regional coalitions, which is, with a lot of foresight, thinking that at some point these are going to be powerful enough, or the U.S. backed ones are going to be weak enough where they get displaced.
Mm-hmm. Interesting stuff. I think it's a little too much for me to have too much to say about it, but
any final thoughts on that chapter at all, or section and chapter?
I don't have any. My brain is blank at the moment. I'm tired.
Okay.
Well, I think it's like he's setting it up for, because I've listened to it for so long, I know what's coming, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That you can't, the system doesn't work. You can't institute laws and change it, because they just change them back. They have enough, with their access to the surplus, they just change it back over time.
So I'm wondering about what kind of steps they're going to take if the democratic enterprises end up becoming, more and more powerful. What kind of restrictions they'll be able to place on those? over time. Because if they see the surplus go kind of being diverted and they're bleeding, then and they're the ones who kind of have the power, indirectly through the politicians. Then are they, what kind of measures are they willing to take to limit the growth of those kind of enterprises? Because that would be savvy for them to do, thinking of it in that way. So
I'm sure they are. I mean,
they're probably doing it now.
they're already. You don't talk about Marxism in schools generally. So.
Yeah.
What I suspect is
probably another aim for Marxism. Because the way that Wolff talks about Marxism is not like a system; it is a critique of something, of capitalism. And so, if it only had another name, because that name is so laden, with such such baggage, we should maybe that's what we can do. The three of us come up with a new name and spread it.
I mean, I guess sometimes it goes under the banner of critical political economy, but that doesn't have a catchy ring to it.
Critical political what?
To respond to what you had said, Frank, my guess is that major shareholders, those who own most of the big industries in the United States and control them, that they won't care so much until their profits are seriously threatened. And that would be, they'd be threatened by competition from worker co-ops, for example, if it ever got to that point. But until it reaches that point, I just don't think... I mean, I know that there's a degree of class consciousness. For example, Garl Purvitz and I think also Noam Chomsky talked about how the steel workers, when a steel plant closed in Youngstown, Ohio, they had tried to buy it and convert it into a worker co-op. This is back in the late 70s. And it seemed like it was opposed in part just for reasons of, class conflict. That those who own stuff, who own the company and whatever, didn't want to sell it to the workers or something to that effect. For only that reason, because it was, in every other respect, going to benefit them. And so I guess I shouldn't discount the class warfare entirely that's going on that's waged from above. But at the same time, I just don't think it's a huge concern until their wealth gets directly threatened.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I knew in bringing it up that it's something way down the road that, is a battle that, will be fought then, but...
And I agree with that they'll do more radical things, maybe stronger things, but it's... I don't watch CNN in the main news, so I don't know for sure, but what I read is that the teacher strikes in West Virginia or Virginia.
Yeah, West Virginia.
That they're not on CNN every day saying there's teacher strikes going on, right? Because it's better that you just don't bring that up.
Oh, of course. Yeah, that's
so
always.
They're already doing stuff, right, to suppress
Did
it.
Frank? Did you do you watch TV much, Frank?
Not cable, no.
Because I was curious what kind of coverage the West Virginia teacher strike did get. I mean, it was covered by NPR some on the radio. I was listening to it, and which was generally favorable, but it wasn't super oppositional or anything. Of course, that's NPR, which is left-leaning on that liberal conservative spectrum.
I've only heard it secondhand from teachers that I know.
Yeah, and there's a possibility that Oklahoma teachers are going to go on strike as well.
Yeah, I read something today that says they think it's going to start spreading. It's good.
Yeah, it was bad in Oceanside. I don't know if you guys are aware or not, but they were on strike quite a bit at the school that I actually worked at Oceanside, and they went something like 500 to 600 days without a contract.
Wow.
And they finally got one like 2, 3, 4 months ago. No, maybe 2 months ago, because I was there until December.
Uh-huh.
So they finally got it, and they got something like a 1% raise.
Mm.
And now there's a lot I don't know. I don't know if they got certain secondary things taken care of, like class limits classroom limitations and stuff as far as like student caps and whatnot. But 1%, and they were fighting for a long time, and
See, I
1%.
Yeah, but they didn't end up. They didn't go on strike, right? They just were.
You're correct. They didn't strike. But they picketed every day
Uh-huh.
at the site at Oceanside, and the other schools in the district of Oceanside actually had more participation as far as numbers go. But at Oceanside, it was kind of a mess. It was probably something like 60-40. Those involved versus those who weren't or didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people were complaining just because the woman who was running it at Oceanside, the site of Oceanside, was just overbearing. And they kind of went against it simply because of that.
Yeah.
Which is just like it's ad hoc, has nothing to do with the actual issue. And, but every morning, at least for the semester I was there, which was fall of last year, they were out in the street, maybe 1 to 10 people, depending on which day it was. So, yeah.
If you recall, when we were at the LA meeting, the DAW LA meeting, and we were talking about union co-ops, and I mentioned then that I've been a member of quite a few unions, and in some ways, you could even say come from a union family, although not really. But my mom was a member of a teachers union, and even went on strike before I was born in Coffeen, Illinois. And that was her first year before she had tenure too. But that wasn't a huge influence on me per se. But I have been involved in a lot of unions in the education sector and elsewhere, and I've always tried to be, and I always try to participate to the degree that I can. I've been getting more involved with the UCAFT at the UCR campus. But anyway, I had mentioned at that meeting how unions kind of shoot themselves in the foot sometimes, and people don't want to hear that. I think, progressives and folks that are pro-union, which I count myself in that camp, but they don't want to hear that. And that's unfortunate because you're not going to reverse the trends of the attacks on unions and the decline in union membership unless you address which is in some cases the democratic deficit within unions themselves.
Yeah.
Which and I think nothing is greater than a union that functions democratically, that's a participatory democracy. Those are the most militant and usually the most effective, and there just aren't enough of those, I would argue.
And it almost comes back to the same question, right? How do you run an economy democratically and then break out a union? How do you run a union democratically? Because, like you said, a lot of the bigger ones, in particular, they get controlled by a few people.
Yep. Top down and bureaucratic.
They're getting bought off, and so
it's since we're mentioning teacher strikes, there was a successful one at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, my alma mater. I think I mentioned this to you, Frank. I wrote a piece about it. It was not one I got commissioned because I had trouble connecting with folks that were there directly involved and didn't get it off in time, but I wanted to write it up regardless because it felt close to home, quite literally, back home in Illinois. And the grad assistants, the Graduate Employees Organization, which represents, the TAs on campus, they went on what became the longest strike in U of I history. It was almost 2 weeks. And they were on strike to defend their tuition waivers because those were under threat. And of course, grad assistants need tuition waivers. There's no way most people can afford grad school without it. And the university was just recalcitrant and wasn't going to bend, and everybody was against them. So there was pretty strong public pressure from a lot of alumni and everything, and plus essentially everybody else. But the university was wielding the power that it could. Eventually, some of the folks there occupied the president's building, and were sleeping there overnight, not doing anything disruptive, but as part of the demonstration. And then soon after that, eventually, the university agreed to most of what the GEO was looking for, which is partly wages, but especially the tuition waiver protections.
Yeah.
And they had a strike fund going on. Did I send that to you? The strike fund. They had a GoFundMe. We talked about earlier. They had a GoFundMe thing, which they raised like $10,000.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Have you seen the latest interview that Wolff does? You know, now when Wolff does his show, the first part is free, but the second part, the interview, you have to go on Patreon and pay $3 a month. You pay $3 a month to get access to the second part, which is usually the interview.
The video though, the audio of it all is still free.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yep.
Okay. But have you seen that? He's interviewing a teacher from a small school who the president of the school was left or thrown out or whatever, and so the board, which is all volunteers, they started looking for somebody to come in as the new president of the school, and the faculty of the school, they really run the school. They knew what was going on, and they weren't too keen about having somebody outsider come in and start telling them what to do about the school that they're running. So they went to the board and said, well, why don't you let us try to run it? Give us 6 months, right? We'll try to run it. And the board agreed to that.
Wow.
So they are now running that school like a co-op.
That's awesome.
That is awesome. It reminds me. Go ahead. What were you going to say, Frank?
I was just wondering if that's the latest. That's the latest episode that he's got from Economic Cooking. I gotta watch that.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. I was kind of reminded when we were having this talk here of there was an article that the New York Times ran. I think it was an op-ed about the uprising of professionals. So teachers, adjunct professors, they mentioned, who have had their they still have professional responsibilities, but the benefits and the resources needed in that profession have been continually stripped from them. You know, whether it's decent pay for teachers or whether it's decent working conditions for adjuncts, whatever the case is. And so that's they argued is like one of the major impetus for a lot of the backlash, which is certainly true. Of course, there are other things involved, but I also shared it on the Twitter, because I do have a Twitter handle, and one of the things that I pointed out though is like I don't think it's all just self-interested. Like we need to uphold the privilege of our profession. I think part of it is an understanding of those benefits, which is a lot of what we think of as like workplace democracy, is what's enjoyed by professionals on the job, right? They often don't have to take orders from other folks and that sort of thing. It's one of the great. That's why, you know, being an adjunct, it's still good work. It's just not a good job anymore. And so it's good work, at least to the degree that it being a crappy job doesn't infringe upon those benefits that remain, and that the workplace autonomy, like, you know, being able to self-govern and that sort of thing, which, you know, faculty still do to an extent, although usually the adjuncts far less so. But anyway, what I was thinking was that I think there's some part of people that recognizes that's how work should be, and so it's not just a self-interested thing about protecting the profession and the privileges, but about expanding workplace democracy like that. I should send you guys the article. It was kind of, or the op-ed. It was pretty good.
Yeah, do that. So what do you guys think? Do you guys have anything else you want to put on the table?
Nope.
I need to run it.
I will just let our viewers know that we will next be starting Chapter 3, Crises, Forms of Capitalism, and Beyond, when we meet up again.
Sounds good.
Well, that concludes, then, the reading of Chapter 2 and discussion. This has been the North County San Diego Democracy at Work Action Group. Now we're signing off.